The fall of 2000 would usher in a new presidential election, and both terms of Bill Clinton would come to an end. And the candidates that were nominated by both major political parties would be none other than current Vice President Al Gore for the Democrats and the son of former President George H. Bush Sr., George W. Bush. Okay? George W. Bush, former governor of Texas, popular guy in the South. We're going to try and find things that we're going to get done. Americans love a great opportunity and a great story. Now I draw cats. I do a few impersonations. Um, the 2000 presidential election is arguably the most contentious in American history, largely because it was so close. And the night of the election, it was deemed as being so close that there wasn't a clear winner. And partially because even though Al Gore had slightly more popular votes, there wasn't a winner in the Electoral College. And it came down to the votes in Florida. Whoever won Florida would get the last few remaining popular votes, or rather electoral votes, to complete the plus 271 plus to actually win the election. The problem with Florida is that the election was so close, you're talking maybe perhaps a matter of just a few hundred votes, determining who gets Florida's electoral votes, therefore wins the election. So over the course of the next few days, um, various different representatives would have to manually count votes, and of course Florida had worked, they still had punch cards basically. Instead of like tapping the screen for who you want to vote for, you still had to physically punch a paper card, and votes would have to be tabulated that way. That created this whole counting mess because some cards weren't punched all the way through, and it'd be a hanging chad. And so how do you register the vote? How do you know who voted for who? Which kind of drives the question of a mail-in ballot for the upcoming 2020 presidential election kind of worrisome a little bit. It's like, I can see a lot of opportunities for manipulation there. So, eventually the Supreme Court would have to get involved in the counting of votes. Um, they would overrule the Florida the Florida courts recounting efforts and basically have to um, side with however many votes could officially be counted. And Bush won by over 500 votes, therefore carrying Florida, therefore officially carrying the entire election. So, George Bush's presidency after his January 2001 inauguration would be marked in controversy rather. His political opponents, people who didn't vote for him, automatically began campaigns of "He's not my president. I didn't vote. He didn't win it. His election was stolen." There's all this kind of stuff going on about George W. Bush, and backlash, and various different political organizations were created. 527 organizations to oppose political conservatives and George W. Bush from the very beginning. So he was kind of starting from the back end. And then, of course, he began various different reforms for tax cuts, trying to stimulate the economy, which had kind of fallen down a little bit in the late 90s. And actually by mid 2000, the economy kind of stagnated when some of these dot coms, we're going to talk about those a little bit later, kind of started going by the wayside. So to re-stimulate the economy, he wanted to get more money out there and invested, which met with backlash in that, oh, well, rich people are just going to get richer. Okay, well, there's a reason for things, but otherwise, he also began various campaigns for national testing under the No Child Left Behind, to where there would be more national measures to see how well students were doing in school, so as to hopefully try and encapsulate a larger amount of the population and maintain educational standards. No Child Left Behind is, to this day, is controversial. A lot of different folks in education did not support it. Some did. But otherwise it was met with scrutiny. Um, And then, of course, on September 11th, we're going to talk about this in detail in uh, a few different videos later on down the line, later on in the chapter. The attacks on the Twin Towers, the Pentagon, and that plane that crashed in Pennsylvania on September 11, 2001, had a unifying effect of the country. This country was attacked by uh, religious zealots who wanted to see America fall. And that sparked an idea and a shift away from economic view to more of a national security type view. So the Bush presidency after 9/11 would take the approach that we're going to track down the people who attacked us and we're going to attack their supporters and we're going to focus on national security. And that became a large rallying cry for 2004 when he would go for re-election. One of the things that happened in the meantime, though, was tracking down people who either directly attacked us or harbored those who did, was the Intelligence Committee and the Bush administration uncovering the idea that Saddam Hussein, the leader of Iraq, president of Iraq, if you will, and his Ba'athist regime were allowing Al Qaeda, those responsible for attacking the United States on 9/11, haven in his country. And it was deemed by intelligence committees that Iraq was a threat to the United States. So in the spring of 2003, the United States had rounded up many different troops in Kuwait, our old friend, and we gave an ultimatum. Saddam Hussein and his sons would have to stand down by a certain time, or else the United States is going to go in and physically remove them. They did nothing, so the United States began an invasion of Iraq itself. And systematically, an entire force of 150,000 United States troops and Marines would make their way to Baghdad, eventually seize the capital, and control Iraq, in removing Saddam Hussein, who fled. And that would begin a long, drawn-out occupation, if you will, as dubbed by detractors, of Iraq itself, and establishing a new regime. What happened in the wake of the Iraq War was the idea of there being a power vacuum. We had gone into Iraq because Iraq was deemed as being a threat because they harbored weapons of mass destruction. We knew for a fact that Saddam Hussein, after Desert Storm, had gassed some of his own people, most notably the Kurds up in northern Iraq. Those were an ethnic group who opposed the Hussein regime, and they sought independence for their own ethnicity. Okay, we knew that he used mustard gas and other chemical agents on his own people. Upwards of about 100,000 people is estimated. We couldn't find his weapons, though, but it was deemed as being necessary to remove him because of the threat of those weapons. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about more of those here in a little bit. Otherwise, though, the 2004 presidential campaign and presidential election would take place. The Democrats would nominate John Kerry, senator from Massachusetts, an old Vietnam War vet who had opposed the war and was very vocal about America's involvement there, even testifying on various different congressional committees talking about atrocities that he supposedly witnessed, and many different people who served with him, who served on the swift boats that he supposedly served on in the Mekong Delta, opposed him, and they tried to discredit him. Otherwise, though, George Bush, despite his opposition to the Iraq War, was deemed as being just strong enough. And he carried the 2004 election, and he maintained a second term for president. A year into his second term, Hurricane Katrina would ravage the Gulf Coast of the United States, most notably in Mississippi, and then the most notably in New Orleans itself. George W. Bush had been on his ranch in Texas for a few weeks. And when the hurricane hit, it ravaged New York City, and levees that protected the city from Lake Pontchartrain and the Mississippi River broke, thereby flooding the city. See, the city of New Orleans actually lies below sea level, and it's protected by various different levees to protect it from the Mississippi River and Lake Pontchartrain. The French were very. The French didn't really think out what might happen to New Orleans when they founded it back in the 1600s. They didn't know that, boy, we're surrounded by major bodies of water. If there were to be an excess amount of water, we could basically be a bowl, and our bowl will fill with water. Well, that's what happened when the levees broke during Hurricane Katrina, and New Orleans essentially flooded all over the place, affecting thousands upon thousands of people, and many different people died. George Bush came under scrutiny because even though the state of Louisiana should have reacted faster, George Bush was scrutinized for not responding faster from a federal perspective. And then FEMA became involved, and Bush came under scrutiny and was portrayed as being lackadaisical when people were suffering by having a slow response. So, George Bush's presidency in his second term was marred with him in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina as being not caring about various different aspects. Okay? Even Kanye West would come out and say George Bush doesn't care about black people, blah, 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 and all this stuff. Nowadays, Kanye West is actually a really big Donald Trump supporter, which, okay, whatever. Otherwise, though, George Bush's presidency was marked with 9/11, which we'll talk about in more detail here later, our involvement in Iraq, and Hurricane Katrina. Those were the things that he was, and his presidency was most noted for. I have met George W. Bush before. He's an exceptionally likable human being. He lives here in Dallas. He has largely stayed out of politics, and even when he left office and President Obama was president, he stayed out of the limelight and let Obama do his thing. George W. Bush is a very likable human being. He's sincere. Agree or disagree with his politics, he's exceptionally likable. And a lot of people still like him. So he came under a lot of scrutiny in his presidency, but even people who are large Democrat supporters today, they like W. Okay? But that was George W. Bush's presidency, and we're going to talk about some of the other things that happened, most notably 9/11 and the aftermath, here in a few different videos down the line, a few slides. But otherwise, 2001 to 2009, George W. Bush. My dad was president. I'm president. It's kind of funny. My wife Laura, she went to SMU. She's a librarian. I'm the one who's got a library there. It's pretty funny. Now I sit at home and draw cats and vets. It's a good gesture.